All right. So my name is Håvard Markussen, and I'm a PhD student at the Swedish Defense University, where I study surveillance capitalism, but from a security studies and political science perspective. And so the paper that I'm presenting here today that I've entitled The Political Subject of Surveillance Capitalism is part of that wider research. So in this paper, I start from the observation that in recent years, we have learned that mass surveillance is not merely watching our behavior, but increasingly trying to steer it as well, owing much or through the use of methods for prediction and modification that Mark discussed as well. Now, of course, there has been significant debate over this, over whether or not such practices of modification are indeed effective. Some claim that they are effective, and that they can and do modify and manipulate behavior, and to such an extent even that agency is at risk, and that we might be seeing these so-called ends of autonomy. Others, however, warn against exaggerating the impact of modification and argue that we know too little at this point to draw any conclusions on this, about how effective it is, and the modification is just maybe more effective in marketing, and that regardless of its impact, we are still free to make our own decisions. In any case, though, I want to argue here that the very idea of potentially effective techniques for prediction modification that are trying to steer political and commercial behavior is nonetheless out there and forcefully introduced in public and political discourse by now, owing much to, I think, the popularization of Shoshana Zuboff's work on surveillance capitalism and the scandalization of the Cambridge Analytica revelations. And as such, I argue that we can and should study and explore the political effects of these practices without taking stock in the debates over their effectiveness. And so I want to try and shift the focus away from the practices of modification themselves and instead concentrate on their discursive and political effects. And so argue that regardless of their effectivity, they do have real world political effects that we need to engage with and address. And so based on this research interest, I ask here, how are visions of the ends of autonomy that we see in discourses on the modification of behavior producing certain forms of subjectivity? And importantly, as I comment this from a security studies perspective, how are these visions altering and conditioning, but also being negotiated by and possibly reconciled with wider discourses of politics and security? And in order to find out, I look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and in particular, and also the discourse surrounding its micro-targeting practices. And I look at this as a case study, but I'll get back to that soon. First, I want to say a few things about my theoretical approach and how I approach the question of subjectivity theoretically, and in particular, the question of what I call here surveillance capitalist subjectivity, or the political subject of surveillance capitalism. So what I do is I employ a Lacanian poststructuralist approach to subjectivity. I won't go into detail about this too much, but I do this in order to emphasize that the subject is produced through its link up with the wider social order and its relation to symbolic signifiers of meaning that keeps it from encountering or having to encounter the insecurity of the real. So we cannot analyze subjectivity in isolation, so to speak, but we must always be sensitive to how it is constituted as parts of the social order, and at the same time contributes to the constitution of the social order. And more specifically, I mobilized the work of Jenny Edkins and Danny Rubin-Dufour here and their use of Lacan in their work to identify how the subject of surveillance capitalism specifically might be co-constituted with the social order. So first, Edkins argues that the master signifier of modern politics is sovereignty, the symbolic figure of sovereignty. And so it is the structure of sovereign power and the logics of that structuring that determines how we can imagine politics and security. Now, Dufour, he agrees with this, but he argues that now in postmodern neoliberal times, the sovereignty signifier is fading, and he suggests that the market is emerging as a new master signifier, a new logic around which to structure political life. So the commodification of everything is the new norm, the new religion he holds, and the new culture, even to such an extent that the state is now governed by neoliberal rationalities. And it is in this contestation between the sovereign state and the market as possible master signifiers of social and political life that surveillance capitalism and the question of the ends of autonomy really enters the frame for me in this analysis. These are, I argue, the political stakes of the rise of surveillance capitalism. Because what surveillance capitalism does, according to Zuboff and Han and Harcourt and many others, in their work on variations of surveillance capitalism, is precisely to commodify a new area of life, enforcing market logics on even the human experience, and in particular, the experience of freedom and autonomy itself. In this way, surveillance capitalism and the modification of behavior is an excellent illustration and arguably an epitomization of how the neoliberal market functions as a possible new master signifier and how it is putting into question and putting pressure on the symbol of sovereignty. So when I analyze the Cambridge Analytica case and the discourses surrounding the microtargeting practice, as I'll get to in a second, it is this that I'm looking for. How is the subject produced through and at the same time reproducing symbolic signifiers of meaning, such as here, sovereignty and the logic of the neoliberal market? So now I'll turn to the case study and let you know what I've found out. So to recap quickly first, the Cambridge Analytica scandal is from 2018 is the story of how Facebook gave a private company called Cambridge Analytica access to its users' data so that it could create psychological profiles of voters, so-called psychographics, and micro-target them with personalized ads. Basing these psychological profiles largely on Facebook likes, but linking them with other data points and data sets and looking for large-scale patterns in this data, he was able to make jarringly, according to some precise predictions about individual users' personal traits and thus anticipate what would trigger a certain outcome in the ballot box. And he used fake news a lot for this as well, and I'll get back to that soon and discuss the significance of that. And according to some, they also used this information to persuade individual voters and on a larger scale sway public opinion to tip election results, most prominently and famously in the Trump and Brexit referendum and the Trump election in 2016. And when I analyze this, just a brief note on the material, I focus on the statements of the whistleblowers in the case, most importantly, Chris Wiley that we see in the picture here, but also Brittany Kaiser was a whistleblower in the case. And this is because they spoke out early on the case and were able to really set the agenda for the ensuing debate. And so their voices are, I think, authoritative in this discourse. But I also look at other materials such as hearings in the US Senate, the UK Parliament, and the European Parliament. There are many of those, as well as the general media coverage to get a broader scope here. So what I find in this material, as a brief preview here, is that representations of Cambridge Analytica's practice of micro-targeting produce the subject of surveillance or the political subject of surveillance capitalism through two main but intimately connected tensions. So first, there is tension between the level of personalization on targeted information and the level of fakeness on that information. And secondly, there is a tension between the concern for agency and the concern for privacy. And they both negotiate ways in which the subject is free and rational and how it relates to truth and different kinds of truth. So I'll elaborate on both in turn now and also explain why I think this is important from the point of view of the wider sovereignty market tension that I just discussed. All right, so first there's the tension between the level of personalization and fakeness of information. So on the one hand, as we see on the left side of the slide here, there is the view that micro-targeting is a problem because it personalizes information, because it is able to customize advertisements and information for each individual, and so this way exploits the emotional vulnerabilities that each one of us have. For instance, Christopher Wiley explains how Cambridge Analytica used micro-targeting to, quote, exploit what we knew about them, that is the Facebook users, and target their inner demons, end quote. In this way, suggesting that it was the ability to exploit the vulnerabilities of the individual that really constituted the micro-targeting threat. That was the core of the problem here. And on the other hand, as you see on the right side of the screen, there's the view that micro-targeting is a problem because the information it uses in its targeted ads is false, because it misrepresents reality and misinforms the person that is targeted with this information. A really good illustration of this is that when Brittany Kaiser, the other whistleblower, explains how she reacted with disgust and shock when discovering that Cambridge Analytica had used misinformation in its targeted advertisements. Of course, she was working with developing these techniques at the company at the time. And so she knew that it targeted and personalized information. And so suggests with this reaction that she thought that everything was okay as long as the personalized information was not false, as long as it was true. So microtargeting on her account, in this statement at least, microtargeting of true information was just the normal state of affairs in political campaigning. In this way, fake news in itself for her in this statement is the problem, and not just something that makes the original problem worse, as would be the case with the emphasis on personalization. And this is interesting, I think, because these two different positions reveal different views of the subject that is targeted with microtargeting, specifically having to do with the meaning of truth and how the subject relates to this truth. So first, the emphasis on personalization. Back to the left side of this slide. I argue that, that this emphasis takes truth to be subjective and individual, and as such assumes the subject to live in relation to its own personal truth that is constructed for it based on its own feedbacked emotions, its own demons, in Wiley's words, as opposed to a common objective truth. In this way, rational thinking cannot help the individual access or rediscover the truth. Or more precisely, the subject is not taken to be either rational or irrational, because this language or these concepts doesn't even make much sense in this world. Instead, it is constituted as ontologically emotive, because the subject's thinking and behavior is necessarily steered and decided by its feedback emotional output, again, by its demons, in Wiley's words, that are being looped back at it to modify its behavior. The emphasis on fakeness, on the other hand, back to the right side of the slide, assumes the existence of an objective truth. This way, it produces a social reality in which truth can be accessed and reached through rational thinking and action. Thus, these representations produce a political subject that is ontologically rational as opposed to emotive, instead of as opposed to irrational, meaning it is rational in itself, and its potentially irrational behavior necessarily stems from manipulation or distortion of information, such as the targeted spread of fake news. And so the potential removal or efforts to remove fake news would, in this scenario, in this image, be able to reunite the subject with the truth in its original symbiosis. And what we see here, returning to the kind of overarching tension between the sovereignty signifier and the market signifier, is that the emphasis on personalization produces a subject that is steered and controlled according to neoliberal market logics. It is commodified, echo-chambered, and unfree by design, and even in other ways. Whereas the emphasis on fakeness reinstates a sovereign politics by insisting that the subject is rational and free in itself, and that any attempt to compromise that freedom and rationality is simply a surface-level disturbance with no transformative effects on the subject itself, and just another threat against which the sovereign states, security states, must protect and secure its citizens. All right, secondly, there is the tension between the concern for agency and the concern for privacy. So on the one hand, micro-targeting is understood as a threat to human agency. For instance, this is at least implicitly evident in the many arguments that micro-targeting is a threat to democracy, where the logic seems to go that elections cannot be free and fair because micro-targeting makes sure voters are incapable of choosing freely and independently in the ballot box. Moreover, it comes through in more direct claims that agency is at risk as well, like, for example, when Wiley writes in his memoirs that, quote, the rights to life, liberty, association, speech, votes, and conscience are all underpinned with a presumption of agency as they are outputs of that agency, end quote. And related to this, and very important, I think, is also arguments that micro-targeting is moving the future into the present, like Wiley's claim, for instance, that Cambridge Analytica used micro-targeting to simulate future society and to control the future instead of just predicting it. And this is hinting towards as well what Mark described before as preemption and the emergence of a temporality of pure imminence. On the other hand, micro-targeting is understood as a threat to privacy. And the fact that the US Senate hearing on the scandal was titled The Cambridge Analytica and the Future of Data Privacy, and the European Parliament's labeling of their hearings as a personal data breaches probe are good illustrations of this, and so is the Guardian's initial framing of the scandal as a major data breach. And there was also a strong focus on data protection and on privacy in the different hearings as well. And this sort of shows the same thing and gestures towards this same trend. And more than that, and interestingly, Wiley's statements, for instance, that privacy is about human growth and agency, shows how the concern for privacy and agency are often very easily mixed as well. So even when there is a focus on agency, it often comes, or maybe always comes, with a certain concern for privacy as well. So privacy is, it seems, is always part of the story here. And this is important because this distinction too reveals different views of the subject, views that produce the subject in different ways, specifically with regards to how and in what sense it is free from excessive surveillance, but also free in more general terms as a political subject and political being. Because on the one hand, and agency is, following Andreevich et al. From 2020, a distinctly temporal liberty because it is, quote, informed by the past, focused on the present, and oriented towards the future, end quote. So this way, representing the micro-targeting threat as a threat to agency entails representing it as a threat to the subject's capacity to move freely in time. And as such, it constitutes the free or unfree subject as an ontologically temporal being. On the other hand, privacy is intuitively understood as a spatial liberty, although there has been some debate about this in the surveillance studies literature, but it's intuitively understood as a spatial liberty, I think. We understand it in terms of spatial metaphors. We imagine it as a bubble or a sphere around us that must not be pierced or penetrated, and it allows us to move freely and unseen in space. In this way, representing micro-targeting as primarily, or at least in part, a threat to privacy constitutes the free or unfree subject as an ontologically spatial or territorial being, subject, much like the territorial sovereign state. And the reason why this is significant is because the understanding of the subject as temporally free offers a break with the sovereignty signifier and shows how market logics of modification might transform what it means to be a surveilled and political subject at its very foundation. Whereas the understanding of the subject as spatially free reproduces and reinforces the sovereignty signifier by insisting that time is linear and progressive, and that threats to subjects as well as states follow the familiar inside-out trajectory. So in conclusion, and in responding to the initial research question that I put here, we can see from my findings here that representations of the micro-targeting threat in the Cambridge Analytica case that emphasize personalization and loss of agency cause a rupture that enables us to view the subject differently from the modern political subject. Specifically, it allows us to see how it might now, in the age of surveillance capitalism, be subject to a new form of neoliberal or perhaps psychopolitical control, in Han's words, as the market emerges as a new and maybe solidified master signifier. At the same time, we also see that this potential rupture is packaged in a way that makes it fit rather well with discourses of modern political subjectivity after all. And so these persistent discourses of modern politics and security, structured around the symbol of sovereign power, represented in this case by a representational emphasis on fake news and on privacy, function to conceal the violence of neoliberal control. And as such, the seemingly very, very disruptive vision of the ends of autonomy is introduced in the discourse and does indeed make waves by altering how we view the surveillance subject and the political subject, I think. But it is ultimately made largely reconcilable with modern accounts of democratic politics and security. So my analysis shows that modification of behavior is disruptive beyond its supposed and contested effectivity. And it exposes, importantly, the political work that is necessary and required to maintain the illusion of a sovereign, secure state. All right, I'll stop there. And thanks for your time and attention. And I'm happy to take comments and questions